Have you ever been humiliated by someone who thought they were better than you, just because of who you are? Well, what if I told you that a racist cop sitting at dinner made that exact mistake? He insulted a black woman, thinking she was just another easy target. But you won't believe what happens next. The moment this woman reveals her true identity, everything changes. Stick around, and let me tell you how the tables turned in the most unexpected way. Let's dive in. It was a quiet evening at a popular restaurant, a place where people came to unwind after long days. Among the guests, one woman stood out. Michelle was tall, confident, and carried herself with a quiet strength. She had been through more in her life than most people could imagine, yet she moved with grace, never letting anyone see how hard it had been. Her black dress contrasted against her smooth, dark skin, and her piercing eyes reflected both wisdom and resilience. As she sat down, she knew this dinner wouldn't be ordinary. Across the room, James, the cop, was seated with his friends. He had a reputation, loud, proud, and full of bravado. His arrogance was something that matched his uniform. With every laugh, every boast, he made it clear he felt superior to the world around him. But it wasn't just confidence. It was the kind of misplaced entitlement that came from years of unchecked power. As the night went on, Michelle's calmness seemed to rub him the wrong way. When their paths crossed in the restaurant, he couldn't resist a dig, a comment that wasn't just rude. It was laced with racism. James felt untouchable, and he was about to learn the hard way that Michelle was anything but ordinary. James, the cop, sat with his friends at a crowded restaurant, laughing too loudly, clearly enjoying himself. His eyes occasionally darted to a black woman sitting alone at a nearby table, Michelle. She had a quiet confidence about her that irritated him. He wasn't sure why, but something about her just rubbed him the wrong way. Well, what do we have here?" James muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A queen, all alone." His friends chuckled, but Michelle didn't react. She just calmly sipped her drink, unfazed. That made James more uncomfortable than he cared to admit. He leaned toward his group, whispering too loudly, "She must think she's too good for us." The comment was met with laughs from his friends, but Michelle remained unmoved. Her silence angered James, and the irritation he felt bubbled over. He stood up, determined to make her react. He approached her table, towering over her, his tone smug. "What's wrong? Don't feel like talking to regular people?" Michelle didn't even look up immediately. She simply folded her napkin, unfazed. But James wasn't giving up. He took a step closer, blocking her view. "Not going to speak? Or are you too busy thinking you're better than us?" The restaurant fell quiet, and some of the other diners began to glance over, sensing something was brewing. Michelle finally looked up, her eyes calm, unwavering. "Are you always this rude, or is tonight something special?" she asked, her voice steady. James blinked, surprised by her calm response. He had expected a reaction, fear, anger, anything, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated by his uniform, his arrogance, or his attempt to put her down. He scoffed. "I'm just trying to have a little fun here, but you're acting like you're above it all. You don't even belong in this place." Michelle remained, calm, as if she had heard this kind of nonsense 1,000 times before. "It's not my problem that you can't handle people like me, is it?" she said coolly. A wave of tension ran through the room. People were watching, curious, but no one dared to intervene. James's bravado was faltering. He was used to people shrinking in his presence, but Michelle was different. She wasn't budging. "You're not even worth the trouble," James muttered, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice. His confidence was slipping. Michelle's eyes narrowed, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm not the one who needs to prove anything tonight. You are." That hit harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being the one challenged. But what happened next was even more unexpected. Michelle stood up slowly, making sure her height matched his. There was no anger in her demeanor, just a quiet power that filled the space between them. "I think it's time you learn who you're talking to," Michelle said, her words slow and deliberate. James stood frozen, taken aback. He hadn't expected this. What could she possibly say that would make him feel so small? Michelle didn't hesitate. "I don't need to prove myself to you, but you'll soon realize why you're not the one in control here." She wasn't talking, like a random woman at a restaurant. Her words had weight, and James was starting to feel it. The confidence he had taken for granted was now slipping through his fingers. "Who are you, really?" James muttered, not quite sure what was happening, but sensing that Michelle wasn't just any woman. There was something in her calm, measured tone that made his gut twist with unease. Michelle didn't answer right away. She took her time, letting the tension in the air build. "You'll know soon enough," she said. And then, with a slight smile, she added, "Trust me. You'll regret this." The table around them had fallen completely silent, and the other diners were watching with wide eyes. James stood there, unable to speak, the full weight of Michelle's presence pressing on him. He wanted to dismiss her, to push her aside, but something held him in place. Michelle took a deep breath. "You're about to learn something about me, officer, and it's going to change everything you thought you knew." James didn't know it, yet. But the woman he had tried to humiliate wasn't just a random diner. She wasn't the kind of person who could be silenced by a cop with an attitude, and her next words would make everything he had said to her, everything he had believed, seem like a distant, embarrassing memory. James wasn't used to this. He had always known how to dominate a conversation, especially with women. But Michelle? She wasn't backing down. He couldn't even make her flinch. He leaned in, his tone dripping with mockery. "What, you think you're better than me, huh? Just because you're sitting here all alone?" Michelle didn't flinch. Her eyes were cool and calm, as though she had already seen this act 1,000 times. She folded her napkin slowly and then, with deliberate care, placed it on the table. "Not at all," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the tension. "I just don't have time for rude, insecure people." James blinked, surprised. He was used to people responding with fear or anger, but Michelle's calmness unsettled him. He took a step forward, his words sharper. "You think you can talk to me like that? I'm a cop, lady. I can make your life miserable." Michelle's expression didn't change. She calmly looked at him, her voice unwavering. "And what? You think that gives you the right to treat people however you want?" James froze. He had never been challenged like this before. People didn't question his authority, not like this. His bravado slipped a little as he tried to reassert control. "People like you should know their place," James sneered. Michelle's lips tightened slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. "You're wrong," she said simply. "You don't get to decide my place." The words hit harder than he expected. For the first time, James felt a twinge of doubt. His grip on the situation was slipping. The room seemed to close in on him, and the murmurs of the other diners grew louder. They were watching, waiting. But Michelle wasn't done. "I'm not the one who needs to prove anything here, James," she said. "You are." James scoffed, trying to brush her off. "What do you know? You're just some woman sitting in a restaurant." Michelle's voice dropped a notch, its sharpness cutting through the air. "You're about to learn who I really am." James stood up straighter, trying to maintain some sense of control. "Who you are," he laughed. "What, you think you can intimidate me?" Michelle stood up too, her presence filling the space between them. "I don't need to intimidate you, James. I'm simply telling you the truth." His heart raced now, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. She wasn't just another person. She wasn't just the woman he had mocked and belittled. There was something more, and it was creeping up on him fast. "Who do you think you are?" James asked, the arrogance in his voice beginning to crack. "I'm someone who doesn't take crap from people like you," Michelle replied, and you're about to find out why." She didn't raise her voice, but her words were like a hammer. There was something in the way she carried herself, a quiet strength that made his chest tighten. He didn't know who she was, but he was starting to realize he had messed with the wrong person. James tried to dismiss it, tried to tell himself that this was nothing, but deep down, something was gnawing at him. She wasn't backing down, and the power he had taken for granted was starting to slip away. "Do you even know who I am?" James asked, his voice now shaky, not quite the confident cop he had been just moments before. Michelle didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence hang in the air for a moment, drawing out the tension. The room was completely still. Now, everyone watching, everyone waiting for her next words. "I think it's time you find out," Michelle finally said, her voice low, intense. "And when you do, you'll realize just how wrong you were." James's heart pounded in his chest. He felt exposed now, vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. He didn't know what she was about to reveal, but he knew it was something big. With one final look, Michelle took a step back, her gaze never leaving his. "I think you should sit down," she said, "because what happens next is going to change everything." James had never been this nervous in his entire career. The arrogance that had once defined him was fading into the background, replaced with a sinking feeling. Michelle wasn't like the others. She wasn't intimidated by his badge, his uniform, or his position. Her calmness was unnerving, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about power. He had mocked her. He had belittled her. But now, with every word she spoke, James felt himself losing control. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. "Who do you think you are?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Michelle didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm someone who doesn't back down. Someone who doesn't let people like you walk all over her," she said, her voice steady but full of intensity. James could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He was the one who had always been in charge. He had always controlled the room. But Michelle was different. She wasn't afraid of him, and that was something he couldn't quite understand. "You can't just walk around talking to people like that," Michelle continued, her tone sharp. "You think your badge makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something, James. People like you have been getting away with this for too long." The room was eerily quiet now, as if everyone else was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. James was still trying to process what she had just said. This wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to. He was supposed to be the one in control, but now it was clear that Michelle had all the power in this moment. "Do you know who I am?" Michelle's voice cut through the silence, and for a moment, James felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't expected her to ask that. Who was she? She was just a woman, sitting at a table, minding her business. At least, that's what he had thought. "I don't care who you are," James said, trying to sound confident, but it came out more like a defensive growl. "You're just some woman who thinks she can lecture me." Michelle didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. And then, with a smile that sent a shiver through James's spine, she dropped the bombshell. "I'm a federal agent," she said, her voice almost a whisper. James froze. The words echoed in his mind, over and over again. A federal agent? Couldn't believe it. The woman he had been mocking, belittling, was a part of the very system he thought he had power over. But she wasn't just any agent. She was someone important, someone who had the resources to make his life miserable in an instant. "I've been undercover for months," Michelle continued, her voice steady, "and all this time, you've been using your badge to intimidate people, to hurt them. You thought you could push me around because you thought I was just a nobody." James's heart pounded in his chest. He was in disbelief. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had just insulted a federal agent. He had no idea what kind of trouble he was in now. Michelle didn't wait for him to respond. She continued, "You can keep playing the tough guy all you want, James, but I'm not afraid of you, and there's a lot of people who won't be either." His face went pale. He could feel his entire world shifting beneath his feet. The room seemed to close in around him. All of his confidence, all of his bravado, crumbled in an instant. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. "You'll be hearing from my superiors soon," Michelle said coolly, standing up from the table. "This isn't over." James stood there, frozen, as she turned and walked away, her back straight and her pace steady. He didn't know what to do. The room was silent, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had made a huge mistake. As Michelle walked out the door, James was left standing there. His mind racing. The power he had always held over others, the confidence he had built over the years, was gone in a heartbeat. He had been outplayed, and the worst part was, he had no idea what was coming next. After Michelle's stunning revelation, the atmosphere in the restaurant was thick with tension. James, a man used to throwing his weight around, now felt like a man who had been stripped of his armor. He sat there, stunned and silent, his mind racing. The woman who had been nothing but an easy target for his racist remarks now stood before him, not just as a challenge but as someone who held his career in her hands. Michelle, though, remained composed, giving James no room for excuses, no chance for escape. Her calm demeanor was disarming. She had been watching him, studying his every move, and now, with one simple gesture, she had turned his world upside down. James stood frozen, his mind processing everything that had just happened. His first instinct was to retaliate, to stand his ground. But deep down, he knew it would be useless. He couldn't fight her. She wasn't just a woman. She was an agent of the law, someone whose words carried far more weight than his badge ever could. And the truth was, he had no idea what she had on him, how deep the investigation ran, or how much of his misconduct she had already uncovered. The worst part for James was that he had been so confident, so sure of himself in that moment. His words had flowed freely, his arrogance overwhelming the situation. But all of that was gone now. The power had shifted, and he felt it in every fiber of his being. Michelle's revelation was more than just about exposing his flaws. It was a reckoning, a reminder that no one was beyond the reach of justice, no matter how high they thought they stood. As James sat there, his pride shattered, Michelle's words echoed in his mind. "You won't get away with much longer." How she had stripped him of his arrogance, forced him to face the very system he thought he could control. And in that moment, Michelle became something more than just a person he had insulted. She became a symbol of justice, a symbol that power didn't lie in badges or titles but in truth, integrity, and courage. The weight of her final words lingered. The other diners who had witnessed the exchange were now watching James. Some whispered, others sat in shocked silence, but all understood what had just transpired. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right, of holding people accountable, no matter who they are or what they think they can get away with. James tried to gather his composure, but it was clear that he had lost something far more valuable than his confidence. He had lost his sense of invincibility. And now, as the realization hit him, he understood that the consequences of his actions were just beginning. Michelle left the restaurant with quiet dignity, and James stayed behind, his mind spinning, overwhelmed by the truth. It was clear that he had underestimated her, and now the consequences of that mistake would unfold in ways he couldn't even imagine. And as Michelle walked out the door, she knew this wasn't just about exposing one man, it was about sending a message that no one, no matter their title or position, could escape accountability when they crossed the line. Michelle's response to James, the racist cop, had shaken the restaurant. She stood tall, unwavering, and reminded him, no one can hide behind their badge and be allowed to disrespect others. The atmosphere had completely shifted. No longer was she the victim. She had taken back her power, and James, shocked and humiliated, was left speechless. This wasn't just about one person standing up. It was a wake-up call to everyone watching. Michelle had forced others to confront their own silence and complacency. Her actions sparked a conversation that went beyond the restaurant, one that needed to happen. Michelle didn't just change the narrative for herself, she made sure everyone knew that racism and injustice wouldn't go unchecked anymore. And the message was clear. If we all rise up when we see something wrong, we can make a change. So, here's the challenge. What will you do when you see injustice? Will you stay silent or speak out like Michelle did? Drop a comment below and let us know what actions you'll take to stand up for what's right. Share this message because change begins with all of us.